Another exciting, inspiring, and very instructive game of chess between two of the world's most powerful supercomputers. And these two have been playing against each other since 2017, or maybe 2019. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Now, these two have been playing perhaps hundreds, if not thousands, of games. Now, I'm a bit biased because I'm a fan of the Alpha Beta program, which was used by Alpha Zero and Leelah Chess Zero. In this game, Leelah is playing white and Stockfish is playing black, and white opens up with 1e4, and black respond by playing e6, and the game continue with d4, d5, and knight d2. We have French defense on the board, the Taras variation, and black continue by developing its pieces to knight f3, and white attacks the knight by pushing the pawn to e5, and the knight retreats to d7. White further develops its pieces by playing bishop d3, and black attacks the central squares by playing c5, and white defends this by playing c3, and black further advances its pieces on the queen side by playing b5. Now, b5 is not new to me. I have seen this a lot of times during my online games, and I have to admit that I did not fully understand the position, or I did not fully understand the sacrifice of a pawn. Now, if I can remember correctly, most of my games, I believe that I captured the pawn on b5 with my bishop, and my opponents will just play a6 just to drive my bishop away, and I will be happy to retreat my bishop to d3 or to e2 squares. But nowadays, the engine recommends that the best move will be queen b6. Now, queen b6 is really strong because if the bishop captures the pawn on b5, the queen automatically or directly attacks the bishop on b5, as well as the central pawn or the central square d4. Now the game continues with knight e2, queen b6, castle, knight c6, and a3. Now let me show you a sideline in case if the black pieces decide not to play the most obvious move, which is pawn takes pawn, and would rather play random developing moves such as bishop e7. Now, bishop e7 is a normal human move. If I was the one playing the black pieces, I would play bishop e7 without even thinking twice. However, if any random moves or developing moves is played by black, then white can continue by pushing b4, challenging the c5 square. And if black pushes the pawn and attacks the bishop, then the bishop can just retreat one square on c2. And in this position, the engine is giving the white pieces a plus 0.7 advantage. Now, what is plus 0.7 advantage with a human player? It's nothing. It's just a small advantage. If you look at the evaluation bar, then it's really small. And even I myself won't be able to convert it into a win by just looking at the position. It's really difficult to judge because it's still in the middle game. Now, the only logical explanation I have is that the reason probably, and I say probably because I don't know the answer, and I'm just guessing that the reason probably is because most of the white pieces have access to the king side space. Now, if in case in the future the black king decides to castle short, then the white pieces can now slowly forward the F, the G, and the H pawn, slowly choking the black's king, and storm its black's position. That's probably the reason why the engine is giving the white pieces a small or slight advantage. Now let's go back to when white played a3. Now in this position the game continued with black playing the most obvious move, which is pawn takes pawn, and white respond with pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, and the black queen munches the white knight on d4. Knight attacks the queen happily retreats back to b6 with material gain, and the game continue with b4, a6, and the bishop attacks the queen, and the queen retreats back to its original square. Now in this position, knowing if you are the one playing the white pieces, knowing that you have a slight advantage of plus 0.6 or plus 0.7 due to the fact that you have, or your pieces have, access to the open space on the king side, what will you do? Well, if you don't know the answer, or if we don't know the answer, then we will let Leelah answer the question. Therefore, Leelah pushes the flank pawn or the h pawn to h4, and black develops the bishop or light squared bishop to b7, aiming to push the pawn forward like this, freeing itself from its cramped position. Now the game continue with Leelah pushing the pawn to h5, further advancing on the king side, and black decides to push the bishop or develop the bishop to e7. Now upon seeing this, at first I questioned myself why black did not push the pawn to h6, stopping the advance of the white h pawn. Now I realized that if black pushes the pawn to h6, then this pawn will become a hook, and it will become a target later on for the white pieces to attack. That is probably why Stockfish did not play this move. Rather, Stockfish developed the dark squared bishop to e7 instead. Now the game continue with bishop blocking the d pawn so that it won't advance and free itself from its cramped position, and dominating the center or the central squares. Now black king decide to castle short, queen e2, and pawn h6. Now I've asked earlier about if you are the one playing the white pieces, and this time I'm gonna ask, what if you are the one playing the black pieces? Now I have an idea. Maybe you have ideas too, or to those who are watching this video. My idea is about creating all the time a counterplay. Now where will you create a counterplay in this position? So in my opinion, the only counterplay that I can create is through the open C file. Now how do I do that? So the knight can hop to b6 and create an outpost at c4. If the knight reaches to c4, then the knight will not be challenged there in the middle game. Perhaps in the end game it will be challenged, but for the time being we are still in the middle game, then the knight there will not be challenged. Why? It's because it will open up the position, or it will open up the cramp position for black. Now we will see it later on why I said that, because it was not really explained by the engine, but it's quite obvious how Leelah demonstrate to prevent the black pieces from maneuvering. Now the game continue with Leelah playing queen e3. Now queen e3 is creating a battery between queen and bishop, preventing the knight to hop to b6. Now Leelah really understand the counterplay for black, and the game continue with rook a to c8, knight move back to h2. Now this is one good idea as well. That is why I said this is a very instructive game, because when Leelah pushes the pawn or the flank pawn to h4 earlier, it creates a hole or a vacant square for the knight to hop and maneuver later on to g4. Therefore this is a really instructive game on how to create something like a hole or a vacant square for your pieces, so that it can maneuver through that square. Now the game continue again by black playing rook c4. Now like I said earlier, if the knight reaches here to c4, it cannot be challenged, and the same is true with the rook on c4, because if and only if the bishop was or is tempted to capture the rook, then the d pawn will capture back the bishop on c4, and it will now open the diagonal for the light squared bishop, and it will free itself, and most of the black pieces are now chilling if that will happen. Therefore Leelah could not afford to let it happen and did not capture the rook on c4. The game continue with knight g4 and rook e8, rook a to d1, bishop back to its original square, and queen g3 with the obvious threat of knight takes h6. Like I said, this pawn becomes a hook, and it will become a target later on for the white pieces, and now it happened. So the only way to prevent that is queen g5, and bishop moves back to e2, king h8, and pawn f4 attacking the queen. Queen captured the pawn, and in this position the knight hops to f6 attacking the queen. The rook on e8 is hanging, the knight is hanging. There are a lot of pieces that's hanging here. The queen is hanging, the bishop is hanging, and as well as the knight is also hanging. So what will black do in this position? So Stockfish decided to capture the bishop, and Leelah captured the rook, winning the exchange. And then bishop moves to c6, a pawn push forward, continuing to break up black's position. Pawn takes pawn. Rook attacks the queen. Queen offered in exchange. White queen accepted. Pawn takes queen. And now e pawn push to e6, totally breaking up the black's position. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. King g8. Knight moves back to d6. Bishop captured knight. Rook takes bishop. And in this position, the rook can now see or attack the knight, the pawn, and the bishop. In the future, if the bishop moves, then the rook can capture either the knight or the pawn. Game continue with h5, g3, king f7, king f2, knight f6, king e3, h4, pawn takes pawn, and g3. Now the pawn on g3 has only 2 square left for promotion. Therefore Leelah was forced to guard the promotion square by moving the rook d to g1. King attacks the rook. Bishop defend. Wait, bishop is now x-raying the king. So if the rook moves like capture the bishop, then it will be a discovered check. Now Stockfish, being the mighty chess engine, did not move his king to prevent a discovered check. Instead, Stockfish moves the bishop because it cannot run away, or maybe the bishop can just go somewhere or elsewhere, right? Like move back there, or I don't know. Oh, still they capture the pawn here, or if the bishop moves there, then the rook can capture this with a discovered check again. So yes, a bishop just moved back to d7, and Leelah captured the pawn with a check. Now the king moves to f7 again. Leelah offered an exchange of rooks. Black checked the king, and the rook covers the check, and at the same time protecting the pawn on a3. Now rook moves back. Bishop moves back, attacking the knight. The knight moves to defend the pawn on g3, and the rook, or the white rook, offers another exchange. King moves up. Rook g to c1, double up, and the pawn advanced to g2. It's only 1 square left for the promotion. Rook takes rook, pawn takes rook, and king attacks the pawn on g2. Bishop gives a check, and the king moves up and attacks the knight instead, leaving the pawn on g2 unattended with only 1 square left for promotion. However, the knight is seeing, the bishop is seeing the promotion square, and as well as the rook, so therefore it's still safe to leave the pawn unattended. Now the game continue with pawn protects the knight, and then the bishop moves back to the promotion square in case if the white pieces forgets that the pawn is promoting. So knight check the king, king moves back, knight check again, and the king moves to h2, helping the bishop guards the pawn on g2. Now bishop protects the c pawn. Rook gives a check. Kings hide. Bishop moves up, and bishop develops, and rook attacks the bishop. Bishop moves back. a pawn to a4. Bishop attacks the a pawn. Rook attacks the knight. Bishop captured the a pawn, and rook attacks the g6 pawn and the g2 pawns. Now bishop defends the g6. Bishop moved back to a1. King moves back to e7, and now the rook attacks 3 pawn islands. Sooner or later, the black pieces will have to give up some materials because it cannot defend all of them, because these are all pawn islands, and it's so difficult to defend. Bishop f7. King takes pawn on g2. Pawn moves forward. Bishop captures it. Bishop attacks the rook. Bishop moves up. Knight gives a check. King moves up. And after a few minutes of shuffling, this position was reached, and the rook attacks the a6 pawn, which the rook captures. And this engine's really looking for some getaway or something. And again, after few minutes of maneuvering and shuffling, we have reached this position, and the rook captures the bishop, and black resigns. And it proves that the rook is the most dominant piece in the endgame. Therefore, black resigns because it's hopeless and it's a losing endgame position. Now, I hope that you have learned something out of this, and hantod sa sunod, hindi na lang tataman.